The first thing everyone heard was her laugh. Sharp, public, deliberate. It cut through the roar of jet engines and echoed across the testing hangar of Aegis Aeronautics like a slap meant to leave a mark. Daniel Carter froze with one knee on the concrete floor, his gloved hand still pressed into a dark smear of hydraulic oil. Above him on the steel catwalk, Rachel Whitmore did not even bother to lower her voice. She only glanced down heels, stopping for half a second, just long enough to make sure everyone was watching. "Careful," she said coolly. "Those engines aren't for people who spend their lives pushing mops." A few executives chuckled. Not loudly, not proudly. The kind of laughter that existed only to prove loyalty. Daniel said nothing. He kept scrubbing, slow and steady, as if the floor itself were the only thing that mattered in the world. Behind reinforced glass, a prototype jet engine gleamed under white industrial lights, all sharp edges and restrained violence. The kind of machine that lived for the sky. The kind of machine Daniel had once trusted with his life. Rachel Whitmore moved on her entourage, flowing behind her like a current that refused to slow. At 34, she was the youngest chief executive officer in the company's history, a fact that followed her everywhere like a shadow. Aegis Aeronautics had been built by her father, a man whose name still carried weight in military contracts and congressional hallways. He had died 8 months earlier, collapsing in his office from a heart that finally failed under decades of pressure. Rachel inherited everything. The company, the scrutiny, the unspoken expectation that she would either rise fast or fall publicly. So she rose hard. She fired engineers twice her age. She slashed budgets that did not produce immediate results. She replaced warmth with precision empathy, with efficiency. In her mind, the world was simple. There were people who designed the future and people who cleaned up after it. Respect flowed one way, downward. She believed that if she stopped pushing for even a moment, the ground beneath her would crack open. Below the catwalk, Daniel finished scrubbing the stain until the concrete was pale again. He stood slowly, careful with his back, the familiar dull ache reminding him of limits he never spoke about. His janitor's uniform hung loose on his frame, gray and anonymous, designed to erase the man inside it. He preferred it that way. Being seen was dangerous. Being remembered was worse. He rolled his cart toward the far wall where shadows gathered and people forgot to look. That was when a small figure appeared near the maintenance door, her sneakers scuffing the floor softly. Emily Carter clutched a worn notebook to her chest, dark hair pulled into a crooked ponytail she had tied herself that morning. At 9 years old, she already knew how to stay out of the way. She also knew exactly where to stand, so she could see the engines through the glass. Daniel caught her eye and gave a small nod. "Stay there." She nodded back solemn, then immediately broke into a grin when she saw the engines spin down steam, curling like breath from a living thing. She opened her notebook and began to draw pencil-moving fast lines, confident for a child her age. Intake, exhaust, the curve of the casing. She had been drawing engines for as long as she could remember, even before she knew their names. An older engineer paused nearby, frowning as he watched her sketch. He leaned closer, curiosity tugging at him despite himself. "You know what that part does?" he asked, gently pointing. Emily nodded without looking up. "It controls pressure at altitude. If it's reversed, the chamber destabilizes." She said it like a fact, not a performance. The engineer blinked. Daniel turned away before the man could ask more questions. On the catwalk above, Rachel Whitmore finished her tour and dismissed the contractors with a firm handshake and a sharper smile. As she descended the stairs, her gaze drifted across the hangar out of habit, checking posture, productivity control. That was when she saw the child. a small girl sitting far too close to a restricted area pencil, scratching across paper like she belonged there. Rachel's steps slowed. Something tightened in her chest, irritation mixed with something else she refused to name. She approached, heels clicking the sound, announcing authority before her voice ever needed to. "Who let you in here?" she demanded. Emily looked up, startled. Her eyes were wide dark, unafraid but unsure. "I was just drawing," she said quietly. Rachel's gaze flicked to the notebook, then to the engine, then finally to the man in the gray uniform moving toward them far too slowly. The pieces assembled themselves into a story Rachel had already decided she understood. She straightened, jaw tightening. "This is a testing facility," she said, her tone cold enough to freeze motion. "Not a playground, not a classroom. Dreams don't belong here." Daniel reached them then, breath-controlled voice, respectful. "I'm sorry, ma'am. She won't be back here." Rachel looked at him fully for the first time. Took in the uniform, the calloused hands, the way he stood like someone who had learned to brace for impact long ago. "You think mopping floors in a hangar gets you closer to the sky?" she asked. The question was not meant to be answered. Daniel lowered his eyes. He placed a gentle hand on Emily's shoulder, guiding her away without a word. As they walked, Emily looked up at him, confusion clouding her face. "Dad," she whispered, "you used to fly, didn't you?" Daniel swallowed. "Not anymore," he said softly. "But you can." Rachel watched them leave, irritation still buzzing beneath her skin. She turned away, already dismissing the moment as a distraction. She did not notice the way the older engineer continued staring after the janitor, his brow furrowed, memory stirring. She did not see the way Daniel's posture changed once he was out of sight, how the weight he carried was not in the cart behind him, but in the silence he had learned to live inside. And she certainly did not know that the man she had just reduced to a punchline was someone who had once lived above the clouds, trusted with lives, trusted with secrets, trusted with the kind of power that did not need a title to exist. Daniel Carter had learned to live with the weight long before the world decided he was invisible. It settled into his spine years ago, not just as damaged vertebrae and scar tissue, but as memory. Memory had mass. It pressed down when he stood too long, when the air changed, when the smell of fuel crept into places it did not belong. Some nights it woke him before dawn, heart-racing lungs searching for altitude that no longer existed. Before the mop, before the gray uniform, before Phoenix and the hangar and the quiet humiliation of being spoken over, Daniel had lived in the sky. He had earned it. He was 23 when the Air Force selected him for advanced fighter training, young enough to believe fear was something you outgrew if you flew fast enough. The instructors called him calm. His wingmen called him steady. In the cockpit of an F-15 Strike Eagle, Daniel became something precise and ruthless in the best way. Hands firm, mind sharp, no wasted motion. He did not chase glory. He chased control. Missions went smoother when he was in formation. People trusted him without knowing why. The accident came during a training exercise over the Nevada desert, the kind meant to simulate chaos without consequences. 1 minute, the sky was empty and endless. The next, his wingman's engine flamed out at altitude warning lights screaming as the jet began to yaw. Protocol said, "Break formation. Save yourself. Let the other pilot eject." Daniel did not. He stayed. He talked his wingman through the descent voice steady while turbulence battered them both. Sandstorms rose like walls swallowing the horizon. Ground fire lit the sky where it should not have existed. They made it down. Both jets alive long enough to matter. Daniel's was not so lucky on the way out. Shrapnel tore through the fuselage. The ejection was violent. Necessary. Final. He woke 2 days later in a field hospital with a spine that would never again tolerate high G turns. The doctors spoke gently. Too gently. Words like miracle and survival and honorable discharge floated through the room. Daniel listened without hearing. He stared at the ceiling and tried to remember what the sky felt like when it belonged to him. They pinned a medal to his chest a month later. He never wore it again. Sarah was there through all of it. His wife, his anchor. She sat beside his bed during physical therapy sessions, fingers laced through his smiling, even when pain made his hands shake too badly to return the grip. She told him it would be all right. That flying was not who he was, just something he did. He believed her because he wanted to. Then cancer took her in under a year. It was aggressive, unfair, the kind that did not wait for permission. Daniel watched her grow smaller in the hospital bed, watched confidence drain from her eyes as machines took over the work her body could no longer do. On the last night, his back spasmed so badly he could not lean close enough to hold her hand without trembling. He hated himself for that, more than for anything else that had ever been taken from him. Emily was 6 when her mother died. Old enough to understand absence. Young enough to believe it was her fault. Daniel learned how to pack lunches, how to braid hair badly, how to read bedtime stories while staring at the ceiling so his daughter would not see the tears gather. He learned that grief did not arrive all at once. It arrived in pieces. A sock left in the dryer, a mug in the wrong cabinet, a laugh that stopped halfway through because no one answered it. Money disappeared quietly. Medical bills, therapy, adjustments to the apartment so he could move without constant pain. Veteran benefits helped, but help was not the same as enough. Jobs disappeared when employers saw the medical history. Too many risks, too many accommodations. Daniel stopped explaining. He took what he could find. Aegis Aeronautics offered night janitorial work with steady pay and no questions. He accepted the uniform the same day. The first week nearly broke him. Walking through hangars where engines rested like sleeping beasts, where engineers argued over thrust ratios and fuel flow, where the sky was always present but never reachable. He learned the routes that avoided glass walls. He learned which supervisors did not look down. He learned how to become part of the background. Then Emily started coming with him after school. She sat quietly at first legs, swinging from a crate, watching machines breathe and cool. She asked questions Daniel did not answer directly. Instead, he gave her notebooks, pencils. He let her draw. He corrected her gently when lines were wrong, when proportions drifted. He did not tell her how he knew. He told her to trust her eye. For Emily, the hangar became a second classroom. For Daniel, it became a reason to endure. He never told her why he stopped flying. He never told her about the desert or the ejection or the pain that still flared when the weather shifted. He told her stories instead, about clouds that looked like oceans, about stars that guided pilots home, about the discipline of listening to a machine and understanding what it needed before it failed. At Aegis, people saw a janitor. They saw a man who moved quietly, who never complained, who kept his head down when executives passed. They did not see the way he paused before certain schematics. They did not see how his eyes tracked pressure graphs instinctively, how his hands twitched when systems were misaligned. They did not want to. Rachel Whitmore did not want to. To her, Daniel Carter was a symbol, not of failure, but of irrelevance. He represented everything she feared becoming if she ever lost control. She did not know his name. She did not care to learn it. She believed the world was fair in one specific way. You earned altitude or you did not. If you fell, it was because you lacked the strength to stay up. What she could not see was that Daniel had already fallen once and survived it. He lived with the knowledge that the ground did not mean defeat. It meant responsibility. It meant choosing where to stand when you could no longer soar. That night, after Emily fell asleep on a cot behind the maintenance bay, Daniel sat alone and rolled up his sleeve. The tattoo stared back at him in the dim light. Iron wings, sharp lines, words etched beneath them that time had not erased. Wings of valor. He lowered the sleeve again and closed his eyes. Some things he knew were not meant to be forgotten. They were meant to wait. Emily Carter did not see the hangar the way adults did. To her, it was not a restricted facility layered with security protocols and liability warnings. It was a cathedral. The ceiling soared higher than any church she had ever seen, ribs of steel stretching upward like the skeleton of something ancient and powerful. Light spilled down in white columns, catching dust in the air until it looked like the building itself was breathing. Machines rested inside it, silent for now, but never asleep. She sat on an overturned crate near the far wall, legs tucked beneath her notebook, balanced carefully on her knees. Her pencil moved fast, then slower, then fast again, chasing the shape in her mind. She drew what she felt more than what she saw. The curve of an engine casing, the slope of an intake, the invisible flow of air that her father had once described as a river you could not touch, but had to respect. Every few seconds, she glanced up at the prototype engine behind the glass, then back down, adjusting a line, erasing, redrawing. Daniel watched her from a distance, hands wrapped around the handle of his cart. He had learned to stand where he could see, without being seen. From here, he could monitor the corridor, the engineers, the doors. Old habits did not fade just because uniforms changed. His back ached, a low, constant reminder of what had been broken and never fully healed, but he ignored it. Pain was familiar. Worry was sharper. Emily's brow furrowed as she added details, tiny notes written in cramped letters only she could read. She had inherited Sarah's focus that way, of narrowing the world down to a single task and refusing to let go until it made sense. Daniel felt the familiar tightness in his chest when he watched her like this. Pride and fear tangled together, inseparable. A shadow fell across Emily's page. She looked up to see an older man standing beside her, tall but slightly stooped, his hair more silver than brown, a faint limp visible when he shifted his weight. He wore the Navy badge of senior engineering staff, the kind that came with decades of experience and very little patience for nonsense. His name, though Emily did not know it yet, was Thomas Reynolds. "That's a clean line," he said, pointing at her drawing. His voice was calm, curious, not condescending. "Where did you learn to draw intake flow like that?" Emily shrugged. "My dad showed me. Not like this." She tapped her temple. "Like stories." Thomas crouched slowly, knees protesting. He studied the page more closely. The drawing was not perfect, but it was intentional. The mistakes were thoughtful. The proportions were wrong in ways that suggested understanding, not guessing. He felt something stir in his chest, a distant memory of briefing rooms and young pilots who asked the right questions. "Do you know why this angle matters?" he asked, pointing to a section most adults would have ignored. Emily nodded. "If it's off, pressure builds where it shouldn't. The engine fights itself." She paused, then added softly, "My dad says machines don't fail suddenly. They warn you. You just have to listen." Thomas looked up. Daniel turned away before their eyes could meet. The engineer stood nodding, once a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You keep listening," he said to Emily. "The sky rewards that." After he walked away, Daniel moved closer. "You okay?" he asked quietly. Emily beamed. He asked real questions, Dad. Daniel smiled back, though his pulse had not slowed. That's good, Em. Finish your drawing. He stepped away again, but Thomas Reynolds did not. From the far end of the hangar, he watched Daniel with narrowed eyes. There was something in the way the janitor moved. Not clumsy, not rushed, economical. The way he avoided blind corners, the way his gaze flicked to monitors without lingering, absorbing information, without appearing to. Thomas had seen that posture before, on flight lines, in briefing rooms, in men who carried responsibility even when no one asked them to. The thought unsettled him. An hour later, the atmosphere in the hangar shifted. It always did before the executives arrived. Conversations hushed. Tools were set down. People straightened their backs as if posture alone could shield them from scrutiny. Daniel felt it too, the change in air pressure that had nothing to do with machines. Rachel Whitmore entered through the main access doors tablet in hand heels, striking the floor with measured authority. She was reviewing data as she walked, eyes scanning numbers, jaw tight with focus. This facility was her battlefield. Every glance, every step was a calculation. She barely noticed the workers who moved aside automatically, until she saw the child. Rachel stopped mid-stride. Her gaze locked onto Emily, seated far too comfortably near restricted equipment. The irritation flared instantly, hot and sharp. Liability, control, appearances. All the things she guarded so fiercely, threatened by a small girl with a notebook. She approached without slowing. "What is this?" Rachel demanded, her voice carrying easily through the hangar. Emily looked up, startled, but not frightened. She had been around authority her whole life, though she did not yet know its many disguises. "I'm drawing," she said honestly. Rachel's eyes flicked to the page, then to the engine, then to Daniel as he moved toward them. The story wrote itself in her mind before anyone spoke. Negligence. Impropriety. A line crossed because someone did not know their place. "This is not a place for children," Rachel said, tone-clipped, "or for fantasies." Daniel stopped at Emily's side. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said evenly. "She won't be in the way." Rachel looked at him fully, then taking inventory the way she did with assets and risks. Gray uniform, worn boots, calloused hands. A man who had learned to disappear. "This facility costs more than most people will earn in a lifetime," she said. "It exists to build the future, not to entertain dreams." Emily's fingers tightened around her pencil. Daniel placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Come on, kiddo." As they turned to leave, Emily hesitated, glancing back at the engine one last time. "Dad," she whispered, voice small but certain. "It wants to fly." Daniel swallowed. "I know." Rachel watched them walk away, irritation still buzzing beneath her skin. She told herself it was a nothing, a distraction, a necessary correction. Yet something lingered, an echo she could not place. For a brief moment, as the janitor's back disappeared into the shadows, she felt the unsettling sensation of having misjudged a variable she did not understand. Above them, the engine cooled, with a soft ticking sound, metal settling, waiting. And in the quiet that followed, Thomas Reynolds stared after Daniel Carter and wondered why a man who cleaned floors stood like someone who once owned the sky. Rachel Whitmore did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Authority sat naturally in her posture, in the way she stood slightly angled, as if the entire hangar had adjusted itself around her presence. "This is a place for people who build the future," she said, eyes sharp as glass. "Not a place for dreaming." The sentence landed with precision, clean and merciless. Conversations nearby thinned to silence. Even the distant hum of equipment seemed to fade, as though the machines themselves understood when power was being exercised. Emily froze. Her notebook trembled faintly in her hands, the pencil trapped between her fingers like a fragile thing she was afraid to drop. She did not cry. She did not argue. Her eyes searched Rachel's face, not for permission, but for understanding, and found none. To Emily, dreaming was not a luxury. It was the only language she had for the sky. She took a half step back instinctively closer to her father, as if gravity itself had shifted beneath her feet. Daniel felt the words strike something deeper than pride. He had been ignored, mocked, spoken over before. Those moments slid past him like weather. This one did not. This one touched his daughter. His body reacted before his mind caught up. He stepped forward, placing himself just slightly in front of Emily, not in defiance, but in protection the way muscle memory had trained him long ago. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said evenly. His voice did not rise. It did not tremble. That restraint cost him more than she could possibly know. "We'll leave." Rachel's gaze shifted fully to him, then slow and deliberate, like a scanner locking onto an unfamiliar object. She took in the gray uniform, the worn boots, the posture that was too straight for a man who pushed carts all night. "You think proximity gives permission," she said coolly. "It doesn't." Her eyes flicked back to Emily, then to the engine behind the glass. "Do you know how much damage curiosity causes when it wanders into places it doesn't belong?" The question was not meant to be answered. It was meant to close a door. Daniel lowered his eyes, not in submission, but in calculation. He felt Emily's small hand brush his sleeve, a silent question. He answered it by squeezing her fingers once. "Come on, kiddo," he said softly. "Let's go." He guided her away without another word, careful not to rush, careful not to look back. He had learned that dignity was not something you demanded. It was something you carried quietly, even when others tried to strip it away. As they walked, Emily whispered, "Dad, did I do something wrong?" Her voice was small, but it held together. Daniel swallowed hard, his throat tightening as old instincts screamed at him to explain, to justify, to defend. "No," he said firmly. "You did nothing wrong." He paused, choosing each word with care. Some people forget that the future starts as a dream. Emily nodded, though her eyes stayed fixed on the floor, the shine gone from them. Behind them, Rachel watched their retreat with narrowed eyes. The irritation lingered sharp and unresolved. She told herself she had done the right thing. Boundaries mattered. Discipline mattered. Control mattered more than sentiment. Still, something about the way the man had stood calm under pressure unsettled her. He had not argued. He had not pleaded. He had simply moved, as if retreat were a tactical choice, not a defeat. The thought irritated her further. She turned away, dismissing the moment, as she always did, by burying it under responsibility. Across the hangar, Thomas Reynolds had seen everything. He had seen the child's face fall. He had seen the man step forward without hesitation. Most of all, he had seen how Daniel Carter absorbed the insult without fracturing the way seasoned pilots absorb turbulence, adjusting instead of resisting. Thomas felt a tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with age. He recognized that stance. He had worn it once himself. It was the stance of someone who had learned the cost of confrontation and chosen restraint anyway. Daniel and Emily reached the maintenance corridor, the noise dimming behind thick steel doors. Emily stopped and looked up at him, eyes glossy but determined. "I still want to fly," she said. It was not a plea. It was a promise. Daniel knelt slowly despite the protest in his back, bringing himself level with her. "And you will," he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried weight. "No one gets to decide that but you." He brushed a stray strand of hair from her face and stood again, pain flaring and then settling into something manageable. Rachel finished her inspection and moved on, but the image followed her longer than she liked. The child's notebook, the man's eyes, the absence of anger where she had expected resentment. It nagged at her, an anomaly she could not easily categorize. She told herself it was irrelevant. People passed through her company every day. Most left no trace. Yet as she climbed the stairs back to the executive level, she felt the faint, unwelcome sensation that something had been set in motion without her consent. That evening, as the hangar lights dimmed and crews filtered out, Daniel sat alone near the maintenance bay, while Emily slept on a folding cot, her notebook resting open on her chest. He watched the steady rise and fall of her breathing, the soft crease between her brows even in sleep. Slowly, deliberately, he rolled up his sleeve. The tattoo emerged under the fluorescent light iron wings, etched into skin that had once known thinner air. He studied it for a long moment, not with nostalgia, but with resolve. Dreams he knew could be grounded, but they could not be destroyed. And some, when pushed too far, learned how to fight back. Thomas Reynolds had spent 4 decades learning when to trust a machine and when to distrust the silence around it. Long before he noticed Daniel Carter, he noticed the absence of mistakes. Floors that were always clean without smelling freshly scrubbed. Tools that were never moved, yet somehow always closer to where they would be needed next. A man who finished his routes without shortcuts, without noise, without complaint. That kind of precision did not come from janitorial training. It came from habit, from systems, from lives that depended on details being right the first time. He began watching Daniel without meaning to, not staring. Watching the way you watch weather when you have flown through storms before. Daniel moved through the hangar like someone mapping space unconsciously, shoulders angled, steps measured. He paused at certain stations longer than required, eyes flicking to pressure monitors and schematic overlays, as if drawn there by gravity. When alarms chirped briefly during diagnostics, Daniel's head always lifted a fraction of a second before anyone else reacted. Thomas told himself it was coincidence. Old engineers saw ghosts everywhere. But ghosts did not have children who sketched exhaust flow correctly on the first try. One afternoon, Thomas passed the maintenance bay and saw Daniel crouched beside a wheeled equipment dolly, tightening a loose bolt that was not technically his responsibility. The motion stopped Thomas mid-stride. Not the act itself, but the way Daniel did it. Wrist angle exact. Pressure firm, then eased. No stripped threads, no wasted torque. Thomas felt a chill creep up his spine, sharp and unwelcome. He had seen that movement before a lifetime ago under desert suns and screaming winds. That night, long after most of the staff had gone home, Thomas sat alone in his office and opened a drawer he rarely touched. Inside lay old photographs and folded programs from ceremonies no one talked about anymore. He pulled out a grainy group photo taken more than a decade earlier at a military gala honoring a classified rescue operation. Faces blurred by time medals, catching light smiles worn carefully. He leaned closer, squinting, then felt his breath hitch. Third from the left. Same build, same jawline, same eyes that did not smile even when the mouth tried to. The man in the photo wore a flight suit. The man in the hangar wore gray. But Thomas had learned long ago that uniforms changed. Gravity did not. The next morning, Thomas mentioned it casually in the break room, voice low as if speaking too loudly might fracture something fragile. You ever hear about the Valor Squadron? He asked a younger engineer named Maya Chen, who was half his age and twice as fast with data. She shrugged. Weren't they declared missing during a training disaster years back? That's the story, Thomas said, stirring his coffee slowly. Stories are usually cleaner than the truth. Maya glanced toward the hangar floor where Daniel pushed his cart past a row of diagnostic consoles. You think that janitor is connected to that? Thomas did not answer immediately. I think he said finally that some people don't stop being who they were just because the world stops looking. Maya frowned. Curiosity sparked despite herself. If he's who you think he is, why would he be here doing that job? Thomas's eyes stayed on Daniel. Because heroes don't always get the ending they earned. The thought lodged in Maya's mind and refused to leave. Over the next few days, others began noticing things they had previously dismissed. How Daniel anticipated problems before they escalated. How he repositioned carts and barriers during stress tests without being asked, clearing paths no one realized they would need. How he flinched just slightly when alarms spiked into certain frequencies, as if his body remembered what those sounds preceded. Whispers spread quietly. Not gossip, speculation. Engineers pulled up old articles during lunch breaks comparing timelines and blurred photos. A declassified mission report surfaced names, redacted details vague, but the date matched. The location matched. The silence matched. Rachel Whitmore heard the whispers during a budget review. She was halfway through a presentation when two junior executives exchanged a look that did not belong in a room designed for obedience. She stopped speaking mid-sentence. "Is there something you'd like to share?" she asked coolly. One of them cleared his throat. "There's talk about one of the maintenance staff." Rachel's patience snapped thin. Talk about janitors is not an agenda item. The word pilot drifted into the room like smoke. Rachel slammed her hand on the table. The sound cracked, sharp and final. Enough. This is a corporation, not a myth factory. Get back to work. Chairs shifted, eyes dropped. The meeting resumed, but the damage was done. The idea lodged itself where she could not dislodge it. That evening, she stood alone in her father's old office, lights dimmed low. She had avoided the room for months, preferring to let it fossilize rather than confront it. On the wall hung a photograph she had not looked at since his funeral. Her father, younger, shaking hands with a pilot in a flight suit. The pilot's face blurred by motion, but the insignia on his chest was unmistakable. Valor Squadron. Her father had mentioned that day only once. She had been a teenager, bored and half listening. He had said a pilot saved his life during an emergency landing in Nevada. A man who refused recognition and vanished. At the time, she had dismissed it as one of his sentimental stories, relics of a past she believed she had surpassed. Now, standing alone, she felt something cold settle in her stomach. She thought of the janitor's eyes. Not angry, not pleading, just tired. She thought of the way he had stood between her and the child without posturing, without fear. She told herself it was coincidence, that people like Daniel Carter did not become heroes. They became invisible. The world required that. On the hangar floor, Daniel felt the shift before he understood it. The looks lingered longer. Conversations paused when he passed. Respect did not appear. Curiosity did. That was more dangerous. He adjusted his routes, kept Emily closer, spoke less. He knew the signs. Attention preceded exposure. Exposure preceded consequences. That night, after Emily fell asleep clutching her notebook, Daniel sat on the edge of the cot and stared at his hands. The scars were old pale against skin that had once burned under open sky. He flexed his fingers slowly, feeling the familiar ache settle into place. He had not come here to be recognized. He had come to survive. To raise his daughters somewhere close to the sky without touching it. Across the facility, systems ran quietly, pressure building where no one was watching closely enough. Machines did not care about rumors or pride. They cared about alignment, and Daniel, whether he wanted to be seen or not, was the only one who could feel something was about to go wrong. He lowered his sleeve over the tattoo and stood, eyes lifting instinctively toward the monitors. The sky, he knew, always collected its debts. The problem did not announce itself with alarms or flashing lights. It arrived the way the most dangerous failures always did, quietly disguised as confidence. 6 hours before the scheduled demonstration, the prototype engine sat mounted on its test rig like a crowned monarch, polished, admired, assumed flawless. Engineers crowded around monitors, voices overlapping in clipped technical jargon, each certain the numbers would settle if given another minute. Rachel Whitmore stood at the center of it, all arms, crossed chin, lifted, projecting control so absolute it felt rehearsed. This demonstration was not just a test. It was a verdict on her leadership, on whether she deserved the seat she had inherited and fought to defend. Pressure readings began to drift. Not enough to trigger alarms, just enough to unsettle those who knew what stability was supposed to look like. Fuel flow oscillated, correcting itself, then overcorrecting. One engineer blamed sensor calibration. Another blamed thermal lag. A third suggested rerunning the diagnostics for safety, his voice thin with doubt. Rachel cut him off. "We don't have time for doubt," she said. "Find the cause." Canceling was not an option, not with defense contractors arriving, not with reporters waiting to decide which narrative would follow her name for the next decade. Along the back wall of the hangar, Daniel Carter moved his mop in slow, deliberate arcs, head-down posture, unremarkable. He had learned that invisibility was a skill. But even as he worked, his eyes flicked upward, tracking the schematic projected across the wall. Lines of color mapped pressure and flow patterns he had once read instinctively at 20,000 feet. His chest tightened. Something was wrong. Not catastrophically yet, but wrong in a way that only grew teeth when ignored. He stopped moving. The second exhaust valve on the schematic pulsed in a rhythm that made no sense. Daniel stared at it, heart rate climbing. The orientation was subtle, almost elegant in its mistake. Reversed flow. At sea level, it might survive. At altitude, it would create a feedback loop, choking the chamber, destabilizing pressure until metal failed. The image burned behind his eyes. He had seen this before. Different engine, same death. Daniel's grip tightened on the mop handle. This was not his place. He was a janitor. A man paid to clean, not to speak. He felt the familiar calculation rise, the one that weighed risk against responsibility. Speak and become visible. Stay silent and let someone else fly an engine that would kill them. His daughter's face flashed through his mind, pencil moving across paper, trusting him without question. He set the mop down. "Excuse me," Daniel said, his voice cutting through the noise sharper than he expected. Heads turned. Rachel's gaze snapped toward him, irritation flaring instantly. "What is it?" she demanded. Daniel swallowed once. "The second exhaust valve," he said evenly. "It's reversed. Flow direction is wrong. That's why your pressure isn't stabilizing. At altitude, it'll fail." The hangar fell silent. A nervous laugh rippled from somewhere near the consoles. An engineer scoffed under his breath. Rachel stepped forward, eyes cold. "I don't need lessons from someone who cleans floors," she said, voice low and dangerous. "Get back to work." Before Daniel could respond, Thomas Reynolds was already moving. His tablet came up, fingers flying with a speed that belied his age. He pulled up the installation schematics, overlaid them with the live feed, then froze. Color drained from his face. "He's right," Thomas said louder than he meant to. The valves installed backward, the flow directions reversed. Rachel turned sharply. But Thomas held up the screen hands, steady despite the weight of the moment. "If we run this engine as is, it'll fail at altitude. Best case, catastrophic shutdown. Worst case, explosion." His voice wavered only at the end. The lead engineer verified it minutes later, swearing under his breath. The room erupted into motion. Orders shouted, tools grabbed, schedules rewritten on the fly. Rachel stood frozen for a heartbeat, the reality slamming into her with physical force. Disaster had been measured in inches, in seconds. In a single correction, she had almost dismissed. She turned back toward Daniel. "How did you know?" she asked. Daniel was already picking up his mop. He glanced over his shoulder once. "Lucky guess," he said quietly, then walked away. Thomas watched him go, certainty settling like stone in his chest. That was not luck. That was memory. That was someone who had lived where mistakes were fatal. The demonstration day arrived under a hard gray sky. The hangar filled with contractors, military officials, journalists, and men whose opinions shaped budgets and careers. The engine gleamed under lights restored, corrected, trusted again. Rachel stood at the podium, voice steady, speaking of innovation and progress, of precision and vision. She did not mention the night of chaos. She did not mention the man in gray who had saved them. Control demanded silence. The test began. For 90 seconds, everything was perfect. Thrust exceeded projections. Pressure held. Smiles spread through the crowd. Rachel allowed herself a breath. Then the gauge spiked, red lights flared, alarms screamed. Smoke poured from the chamber, thick and black. Flames erupted as if the engine itself had turned feral. Panic exploded through the hangar. People scattered. Sprinklers activated too late. A support beam collapsed near the rig. Daniel was already running. He vaulted the barrier without hesitation, grabbed a fire extinguisher, and blasted a path through the flames. Heat slammed into him, pain screaming up his spine as he lifted the fallen beam, trapping a young engineer beneath it. Lucas Bennett, 26, eyes wide with terror. Daniel hauled him free, ignoring the agony tearing through his back. He wrapped his jacket around the shaking man and dragged him towards safety as foam rained down. They collapsed just outside the hangar. Paramedics rushed in. The fire died. Daniel's jacket slipped from his shoulders. His sleeve had torn fabric, shredded from elbow to shoulder. The tattoo stood exposed under harsh white light. Iron wings, sharp lines, words etched beneath them, wings of valor. The noise died instantly. A reporter gasped. Thomas stepped forward, voice shaking. "That's the insignia," he said. "Valor's Squadron." Phones came out. Images pulled up. Grainy photos from years ago. The match was undeniable. Rachel stood frozen, blood draining from her face. Her father's photograph flashed in her mind. The pilot who saved him. The man who disappeared. She looked at Daniel Carter, really looked at him, and saw everything she had refused to see. The sky had not forgotten him. It had just been waiting. The problem did not announce itself with alarms or flashing warnings. It crept in quietly, disguised as confidence and momentum, the kind that convinced everyone they were already too far along to stop. 6 hours before the scheduled demonstration, the prototype engine sat mounted on its test rig, polished to a mirror's shine, admired by engineers who trusted their math, and by executives who trusted the engineers. Rachel Whitmore stood at the center of the hangar, arms crossed, posture rigid with authority. This test was her moment. Contracts headlines and the board's confidence balanced on these numbers. Failure was not a variable she allowed herself to consider. Pressure readings began to drift. Not enough to trigger alarms, but enough to make experienced engineers lean closer to their screens. Fuel flow oscillated, stabilizing, then slipping again. Voices overlapped technical terms, stacking on top of each other as theories formed and collapsed. One engineer suggested recalibrating sensors. Another blamed thermal variance. A third recommended postponing the test to run a full diagnostic. Rachel shut that down immediately. There were journalists, arriving defense officials already en route. Canceling now would fracture the image she had built so carefully. Find the issue, she said sharply. We moved forward. Along the back wall, Daniel Carter pushed his mop slowly, deliberately, head lowered the way it always was during moments of stress. He had learned that invisibility was survival. Still, his eyes betrayed him, lifting again and again to the schematic projected across the wall. Lines of color pulsed with data patterns etched into his mind from another life. His chest tightened. Something was wrong. Not loud, not obvious, but wrong in the way that only revealed itself once it was too late. He stopped moving. Daniel stared at the second exhaust valve on the schematic, his pulse accelerating. The orientation was subtle, elegant in its error. Reversed flow. At ground level, it might behave. At altitude, it would feed back into itself, destabilizing pressure until the chamber tore itself apart. Daniel felt heat crawl up his spine. He had seen this before. Different aircraft, same physics, same ending. Pilots did not get second chances when engineers missed details like this. His hand tightened around the mop handle. This was not his place. He was a janitor. Speaking would make him visible, and visibility had consequences. Staying silent meant trusting that someone else would catch it. Someone else always had before. He thought of Emily, bent over her notebook, trusting him to know what he was doing. He thought of the pilots who would fly this engine someday, unaware of the mistake waiting for them at 20,000 feet. Daniel set the mop down. "Excuse me," he said, his voice cutting through the noise sharper than he intended. The hangar stilled. Rachel turned instantly, irritation flashing across her face. "What is it?" she snapped. Daniel swallowed once. "The second exhaust valve," he said evenly. "It's installed backward. Flow direction is wrong. That's why the pressure won't stabilize. At altitude, it'll fail." Silence dropped like a curtain. A nervous laugh broke from somewhere near the consoles. An engineer shook his head slightly, disbelief automatic. Rachel stepped closer, eyes cold and dismissive. "I don't need advice from someone who cleans floors," she said quietly. "Go back to work." Before Daniel could respond, Thomas Reynolds was already moving. His tablet came up, fingers flying with urgency born of experience. He overlaid installation photos with the schematic and froze. The color drained from his face. "He's right," Thomas said, voice louder than he meant it to be. "The valve is reversed." Rachel spun toward him. What Thomas held up the screen. "If this engine runs at altitude, the chamber destabilizes. Best case, catastrophic shutdown. Worst case, explosion." The lead engineer verified it moments later, swearing under his breath as the truth settled in. Chaos erupted. Tools were grabbed, orders shouted, timelines redrawn in seconds. Disaster had been avoided by a margin measured in inches. Rachel stood still for a heartbeat, the realization hitting her harder than any public failure would have. She turned back toward Daniel. "How did you know?" she asked, her voice different now, stripped of certainty. Daniel was already lifting his mop. He glanced over his shoulder once, Lucky guess, he said quietly, then disappeared back into the shadows. Thomas watched him go, certainty locking into place. That was not luck. That was memory. That was someone who had lived where mistakes killed people. The demonstration day arrived under a steel-gray sky. The hangar filled with contractors, military officials, reporters, and men whose approval moved billions of dollars. The corrected engine gleamed under the lights, restored and trusted once more. Rachel stood at the podium, delivering her speech with flawless composure. Innovation, precision, the future of aviation. She did not mention the night they almost lost everything. She did not mention the janitor. Control demanded silence. The engine roared to life. For 90 seconds, everything was perfect. Pressure held. Thrust exceeded projections. Approval rippled through the crowd. Rachel allowed herself a breath. Then the gauge spiked. Red lights flared. Alarms screamed. Smoke poured from the chamber, thick and black. Flames erupted violently as panic tore through the hangar. People scattered. Sprinklers activated too late. A support beam collapsed near the rig, trapping a young engineer beneath it. Daniel was already running. He vaulted the barrier, grabbed a fire extinguisher, and carved a path through the flames. Heat slammed into him, pain screaming through his damaged spine as he lifted the fallen beam. The engineer Lucas Bennett screamed in terror as Daniel hauled him free. Ignoring the agony, Daniel dragged him toward safety, wrapping his jacket around him as foam rained down and emergency crews flooded the space. They collapsed outside the hangar. The fire died. Sirens wailed. Daniel's jacket slipped from his shoulders. The sleeve had torn completely, exposing the tattoo beneath. Iron wings, sharp and unmistakable. Words etched below them in faded ink. Wings of valor. The noise stopped. A reporter gasped. Phones appeared. Thomas stepped forward, voice shaking. "That's the insignia," he said. "Valor Squadron." Grainy images surfaced on screens, old photographs pulled from forgotten archives. The match was undeniable. Rachel Whitmore stood frozen as her father's photograph burned into her mind. The pilot who saved his life. The man who vanished. She looked at Daniel Carter and understood too late that the sky had never let him go. The hangar was quieter now, emptied of cameras and uniforms, holding only the echo of what had changed. Daniel Carter sat on a bench near the maintenance bay, needle and thread moving steadily through the torn fabric of his jacket. He worked the way he always had, calmly, deliberately, as if restoring something broken was simply another part of the day. Rachel Whitmore stood in the doorway for a long moment before speaking. Her heels were gone, her voice softer, uncertain. She asked why he never told anyone who he was, why he accepted being invisible. Daniel did not look up. He said that titles did not save lives, that applause faded quickly, but consequences lasted. He told her he stayed because his daughter needed to see that losing the sky did not mean losing purpose. Rachel listened, really listened, for the first time since taking her father's chair. She admitted she had mistaken fear for strength and cruelty for control. Tears slipped down her face without permission, and she did not wipe them away. In that moment, that the company, the legacy, and the armor she wore around herself all felt unbearably small. 3 days later, the press filled the conference room. Rachel stood before them in a simple navy suit, her posture open, her voice steady but human. She spoke of mistakes of arrogance, of a man she had wronged, and what his actions revealed about leadership. She named Daniel Carter a hero not for medals refused, but for lives saved and humility chosen. Applause rose and fell, but Daniel stepped back when microphones turned toward him. He said he did not need a title. He needed a place for children like his daughter to learn how flight truly worked. Rachel did not hesitate. She promised funding space and time. She said the company would build a learning center, one that valued integrity over ego and safety over spectacle. Construction began the next morning. Engineers volunteered. Morale shifted. A year later, the Valor Foundation opened its doors, sunlight pouring into rooms filled with simulators and workbenches. Emily stood beside her father, ribbon scissors almost too large for her hands, smiling at a future that suddenly felt reachable. As the sun set that evening, Daniel walked the runway, iron wings exposed beneath rolled fabric, the tattoo catching the fading light. Rachel joined him, no barriers between them now. She asked if he missed flying. He said every day, but he had found something better, a reason to stay grounded. Together they watched children laugh inside the hangar, dreams taking shape. Daniel looked up at the first stars and understood he had never lost his wings. He had simply learned how to use them differently. The night air was cool and steady, carrying the scent of fuel and promise, and for once, neither of them felt alone beneath the vast sky that had finally learned how to hold them both without asking either to fall again or prove their worth ever. From a professional perspective, this story reveals a deeper truth about leadership and human value. Real strength is not proven by authority titles or how high someone stands above others, but by what they protect when pressure arrives. Daniel did not reclaim the sky by returning to a cockpit. He reclaimed it by choosing responsibility over recognition, impact over image. Rachel's transformation shows that true leadership begins the moment we listen to the voices we once ignored. Organizations do not fail because of lack of talent, but because they overlook it. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to like the video, to support stories that honor quiet strength and real character. Subscribe to the channel if you believe powerful lessons can come from unexpected places and unseen people. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Share a short phrase that captures what this story meant to you, something simple, something honest, no more than 3 words. Comment "True Wing"